right. Welcome everybody to our first webinar in our spring webinar series for the Litchfield County Center for Housing Opportunity. I am hoping that you are as excited about this topic as I am, regulating short-term rentals. I'm going to screen share here, and I'm going to need you guys to tell me whether this is in presenter mode or regular big screen mode. So which one can you guys see? The big one?
Yes, I can see that one.
Sure.
Yes.
Great. All right. So just so you know if you're in the right place or not, again, we're going to be talking about regulating short-term rentals today. Just a couple quick background slides in case any of you are not familiar with the Litchfield County Center for Housing Opportunity and the work that we do. It is our mission to coordinate a regional response to the housing affordability challenges in Litchfield County. And to do that, we work together with municipalities, with our local housing nonprofits, with a bunch of cross-sector partners, including our economic development commissions and committees, conservation organizations, and faith-based organizations. And of course, we also work with capacity building resource partners and funders like the Connecticut Department of Housing, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority, LISC, and our community foundations that serve our region. All are very important if we're going to address our significant challenges to housing affordability here. We are working to support a pipeline of 326 new units of affordable housing in 15 towns in Litchfield County. So though it's not very visible to every day to folks, there is a lot going on, a lot of exciting developments in the works. These are just some of them on your screen right now. So we will continue to support those as they move through the process. But today, what we're talking about is short-term rentals. We're going to briefly, just big picture view of how short-term rentals are affecting the availability and affordability of rental housing in our region. And then we're going to get a chance. Chris is here from the town of Great Barrington, Massachusetts, who is about a little over a year into basically what is a town ordinance here, but there in Massachusetts, it's a bylaw regulating short-term rentals. So we're going to learn from Chris about his experience getting basically, again, what would be an ordinance here passed in the town and then enforcing it over the last year. And then I'll also talk about what some other towns are doing to address this issue, including what they're doing around the short-term rental of accessory apartments, and also just some heads up on some proposed state legislation that might be coming up that, again, empowers towns to create an ordinance that regulates short-term rentals. So that is what we will be talking about today. Very quickly, again, how short-term rentals affect affordability and availability of rental options. As many of you know, especially and I see a lot of familiar faces here that have worked on their town's housing affordability plans. There has long been a shortage of any type of rental housing option, affordable or not affordable, in our communities. And so there's a chart here on the side that shows in Litchfield County as a whole, about 23% of folks rent. Statewide, that's 33%. And again, I think that's because of the lack of rental housing options in our communities. In a lot of Litchfield County towns, it's a much smaller portion of units that are available for rent to anyone. And we know that more people are renting now than before, partly because of the sales prices, partly because we don't have that much diversity of housing type, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But also, you know, people are waiting longer and renting for longer before they own. So again, we already had a shortage of rental options for folks, and the demand is increasing. So that's a challenge. The lack of housing type diversity, again, we mainly have single family homes in our towns countywide. 74% of our homes are single family detached. I know in a lot of communities, I see Roxbury, Falls Village, Goshen, it's more like in the 80 or 90% of your housing stock is all single family detached. And so any of the housing options that are available for rent are single family detached, and those are more expensive to rent than a multifamily. In some of our communities, the only multifamily housing available is the affordable multifamily, if you're lucky enough to have it. And as many of you know, there's long waiting lists at all of those developments. So there was already a challenge, again, because of the lack of diverse housing types in our communities and the lack of rental housing that's available to folks. But now, you know, and I'm sure you've seen this over the last, 10 years, the platforms like our Airbnb and VRBO, they've made it so much easier for people, and they're doing a lot of marketing that you've probably heard to everyone about how everyone should rent their houses when they're not there. And so because of that, those platforms that are just making it so much easier to make more money, frankly, than you could on a year-round rental, so many more folks who were renting year-round are now just renting short-term. So that has put an additional strain on the availability of rental housing and the affordability, again, because if you can get the rates that you could get per night, it's obviously much more than you could get for someone who lived there year-round. So this is just one example. This is in the town where I live, Salisbury. And any of you could do this for your town. Look on realtor.com about how many rental options are listed for your town. And then you've got to actually click on them to see how many of them are available for year-round rental and how many of them are actually seasonal rentals. But and then you can go on Airbnb and see how many listings there are short-term rentals for your town. In Salisbury, as an example, there were 27 results on realtor.com, but 25 of those were either summer or winter-only rentals. So the less expensive ones, which are still not affordable to most households, the ones here at the top, 28, 45, 3,900, those were winter rentals. And the $25,000 a month, $20,000 a month, those were summer rentals. Anyway, it might be interesting for any of you to kind of look up what is available. Only 2 of these homes were available for potential year-round rental in Salisbury, where I live. And they were $45,000 a month and $5,900 a month. Obviously, again, not super affordable for folks. And then there were 33 homes listed on Airbnb for our town, for my town. And again, you can see the kinds of nightly and weekly rental prices that folks can get. And I'm just going to remind everybody, if you don't mind just making sure you're muted so we don't get too much background noise, that would be awesome.
Yeah. Do I need to go with you?
Let's see. I'm muting Abby. All right. And then very briefly, before we get to Chris, I just wanted to talk quickly about accessory apartments. I know that a lot of communities have looked towards accessory apartments as being one possible solution for creating more housing options that are more affordable by nature, if not, restricted to being affordable. And so when we did surveys as part of these town housing plan processes, we asked residents whether they had an accessory apartment, whether they were interested in building an accessory apartment, and if they already had one, what were they using it for? And so what we found through those town housing needs surveys for residents is that most people did not have an accessory apartment. Most people weren't interested in creating one. But the folks that did have an accessory apartment, mainly like about half of them were using them for only family or guests. And only some of them actually were using them for short-term rentals. So they were either using them for family or guests or longer-term rentals. And I thought that was really interesting that, and again, here is some examples from Litchfield, Connecticut, Washington, Connecticut, the number of responses that we got and the type of responses. And so some of those accessory apartments are being used for short-term rentals. But again, in these surveys that took place, at least in 2022, and one in Salisbury in 2023, not too many of them were being used that way. But again, most weren't being used to create those year-round housing options for rental housing options for folks. They were being used for family or guests. All right, so now I'm gonna put Chris on the spot. Hopefully he can unmute himself. And Chris, I just threw these slides up there from your website. I can stop sharing or leave it up there while you talk, whichever you prefer.
Okay. Thanks, Jocelyn. Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Rembold. As you can see from that impressive headshot, I'm the Assistant Town Manager and Planning and Community Development Director up here in Great Barrington, up Route 7 from you. Shout out to New Milford. You have a twin town hall building with us, designed by the same people. Looks a little bit different. Anyway, it's kind of neat. A little trivia for you, where Great Barrington here, we, like you, are a very seasonal community. And we are kind of the hub of the Southern Berkshires in Massachusetts. So we're much more year-round than most other towns in the area. Some of the outlying towns of Southern Berkshire County have real seasonality swings and a lot of seasonal properties and short-term rentals. Great Barrington has about 7,100 people year-round, according to the last census, and about 3,600 housing units. We estimate, and it's really hard to put your finger on this, we estimate that about 170 properties are short-term rentals listed on short-term rental platforms. That's current. If you go on AirDNA or other databases online, that varies. Sometimes they track it by zip code, and our zip code is not contiguous with our town, so it gets a little funny. But that gives you some scope of the number of short-term rentals that we know about in the town of Great Barrington. We started talking about short-term rentals in 2016, 2017, identifying many of the problems that Jocelyn just highlighted. The fact that there are very few long-term rentals available in Great Barrington. And in fact, according to a recent housing study, there's a 0% vacancy rate in long-term rentals. So those that are available for long-term rent are taken. And one of the questions for Great Barrington was, can we regulate short-term rentals in a way that might just unlock a few of these units for long-term rent to benefit the community long-term. There was, when we started the debate and, a few years ago before COVID, there were some questions about, well, can we even do this? Can we even regulate short-term rentals? So in about 2018, maybe it was around then, the state of Massachusetts, Commonwealth of Massachusetts, did pass enabling legislation that allowed towns to regulate short-term rentals and collect rooms taxes from them and collect additional 3% fees on certain types of rentals. So for all of these reasons, to try to free up some housing stock and to get a little bit more money in the town coffers, we thought that regulation of short-term rentals might be a good idea. Certainly, as Jocelyn said, there's a lot of incentive to offer your home on Airbnb or VRBO. This is not news to any of you. You can make a lot more money in a lot shorter amount of time with a lot less headache of not having to worry about being a long-term landlord, which in Massachusetts can be quite burdensome. So there's all the reasons in the world for a property owner to offer their property on a short-term basis, 30 days or less, than on a long-term basis. So we did not go into this regulatory process thinking that we would all of a sudden free up a lot of units and allow them to be rented on a long-term basis. We didn't think it would have a huge impact in that regard. But we did recognize that there was a possibility, if left unregulated, first of all, we wouldn't know who they were, or where they were necessarily. If there were health and safety risks, we wouldn't be able to mitigate that in any way. We wouldn't necessarily know if we were collecting all the revenue that we wanted, very important consideration. And if left unregulated, there is a very real possibility, because of those incentives where you can make all kinds of money from your property, there's a very real possibility that neighborhoods could just become hotel districts. And so some of the purposes that we set forth in the bylaw, and as Jocelyn said, in Massachusetts, it's called a bylaw, was to deter commercial interests from basically buying up properties just to rent on a commercial basis. There was some debate about whether that was a protected use in Massachusetts, that people could just use their home on a commercial basis. That's been litigated and litigated again and appealed again and appealed again. So we thought we were better off implementing our own law using the state's enabling legislation and saying, here's what we want to do. We don't want just commercial interests buying up properties just to make a bundle of money. On the other hand, we also realized that a lot of residents here and all over the place are relying on their property to bring in extra income. This is, the new economy, So we did not want to necessarily preclude people who depend on that income from realizing that income. So, excuse me. Thank you, Jocelyn, for putting that on screen. And I did share with Jocelyn the text of the bylaw and some other information that she could feel free to share out with you all. So the Great Barrington bylaw, as you can see here, there are a few key items. It doesn't affect motels, hotels that are they are defined separately. They're excluded from this law. It doesn't affect anything that is quote unquote a long-term rental, meaning 31 days or more. So those are fine. But if you are a short-term rental, if you're offering a room in your house or your whole house or several units, this would apply to you. And it limits it limits the short-term rentals in Great Barrington to really, it's got to be your primary or secondary unit, and you can't rent it on a short-term basis for the entire year. There's a 150-day limit that was passed. That was much debated. in the drafting of this legislation, the number of days per year. Recognizing the fact that a lot of people need extra income. If you are on premises, if you are the owner of that property, you can do it all year long. You can short-term rent a portion of that property if you are there. If this is a second home or you're not there, there's a 150-day limit. So the idea is that that will prevent this property from being a hotel in a residential district, for example. We limited the number of short-term rentals that you can have. You can only have one in Great Barrington. So you can't buy up a bunch of properties and just rent them out on a commercial basis. You can have one. You have to register with the town. And we contracted with an outfit called GovOS. And they are helping us scrub the internet and track who's who and who is listing on short-term rental platforms. And we get a listing of who they are, and we try to encourage them to register if they are not, and come into compliance with the bylaw. And if they're not registered, then we have begun fining. It's been not so successful, but it is happening. This is year one. Maybe we're a couple months only into actually fining.
How much is your fine, Chris?
Good question. I don't know. I think it's governed by the civil penalties law. I think it's like $100 a day for the first offense, and then it goes up to like $250 or $300, but it can compound. So a lot of people were shocked at the fact that they needed to register and that they were getting fined. The first letter that went out that said, hey, we think you are a short-term rental. Our data shows that you're a short-term rental. Did you know we have a local law? And number two, you have to register. And then they got a second letter and a third letter, and then they started getting fines. So that's the way we did it. I will say that the major platforms, Airbnb and VRBO, did take notice of the law. And I believe when you offer a property in Great Barrington, for example, on Airbnb, I don't think they allow you to list it unless you're registered, which is good. I'm glad they're helping us, get the information out there. So, let's see, what else? I will say this is just one very, very small portion of our affordable housing effort. I'm not sure if it's working to, as I said, put more rentals out there on the market long term. I hope it is. It's data that's very difficult to find and to determine. So I think that's enough of a summary and of me talking, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions I can.
Okay, terrific. Maybe I will go ahead and just show real quick what some other towns are doing in Connecticut, and then I'll circle back and get people's questions. Is that okay with you, Chris?
That sounds great.
Okay. So very briefly, I wanted to talk about what some of the other towns are doing. I actually ran across today this very helpful 63-page excerpt of what all of this list over here, all of these other towns in Connecticut have done in the last couple years to regulate short-term rentals. Happy to send that to anybody who is thinking about either doing a town ordinance or a zoning regulation or both. Because it's obviously really helpful to see what some other communities are doing, like Great Barrington. I just wanted to, I guess, highlight 3 examples here of towns of different sizes and what they're doing. And again, the devil's in the details, as I'm sure Chris knows. But as just a few examples of sort of, again, different sized towns, Sherman, Connecticut, which is the smaller town, has basically gone out and stated that short-term rentals are not allowed because they're not specifically permitted under the zoning regulations. The town of Burlington, Connecticut does not allow short-term rentals in accessory apartments, but they are allowed in primary dwellings, but they do require site plan approval. And in New Fairfield, Connecticut, they passed a zoning regulation requiring that short-term rentals pay $500 every 2 years for a permit fee. So you have to re-permit it, I guess, every couple years. And the property owner does have to live on the site or in the abutting property. So it's limited there to folks that live on site or live next to the site. So just a couple details. Again, as I mentioned, Sherman put this notice on their town website basically saying, we don't allow Airbnbs, don't do it. I did talk to the land use planner there today who said they've walked that back a little bit, and they're now actually crafting a town ordinance to deal with this. And I know a lot of communities have thought about doing this through their zoning regulations. And I think a lot of land use administrators and zoning enforcement officers are concerned about doing it that way, and I think would prefer a town ordinance or, sort of like, again, the bylaw that Great Barrington did. So though this town has stated that it's not allowed, they are now drafting an ordinance that will help them kind of enforce that and make it clearer. And again, I mentioned in Burlington, you're not allowed to rent short-term and accessory structure. That's in their accessory apartment regulation. And this is their short-term rental regulation, which again regulates health and safety kind of things, requires a site plan, a site map and floor plan approval. So they can make sure that there's adequate parking, trash, that there aren't any parties happening there, and that the zoning enforcement officer basically has somebody to contact 24 hours a day should there be a concern or something happening on the property. This is New Fairfield's short-term rental zoning regulation, pretty straightforward. They have an occupancy limit, and they're making folks get a permit every 2 years and pay $500 for it. And I did want to just mention, there is a bill going around in the current legislative session, if you haven't heard about it yet. Right now it's called Raised Bill 335. Who knows what will happen to it? There's obviously, with any legislative session, you never know what's going to happen. But it is basically enabling municipalities to adopt an ordinance to regulate short-term rentals, which maybe it sounds like you had that in Massachusetts, Chris, enabling legislation. So obviously that would just help towns feel that much more empowered to go ahead and adopt an ordinance. As you saw on that list, many towns have done it anyway already, and you can look at those examples, but we can let you know if this bill makes it through the legislative process this session. And so, and we don't have to close, but this is my summary slide, and then I'm happy to get questions. I'm sure all of you have a ton of questions for Chris about how it's gone in Great Barrington, how we got it passed, what were some of the things that were considered there. But again, just sort of in closing, I do think short-term rentals have a significant impact both on availability and affordability of housing options. As Chris said, it's hard to know or measure how regulating them can impact that. But in my view, even if it opens up or a few more longer term rentals in a town, that's 2 more than you had before, and they're all needed. But obviously it also, you can regulate the health and safety issues and you know, the neighborhood concerns that come up around short-term rentals as well. You know, I do think that towns should consider ways to address this through either their zoning regulations and or a town ordinance. As Chris mentioned in Great Barrington, you know, you can balance the needs of homeowners that need and can benefit from additional income, but also the town's need for those year-round options for people who want to live in town year-round and or work in town. And so I am happy to send anyone who is interested any of those example ordinances or zoning regulations, and also the details that Chris sent me today on the bylaw in Great Barrington. But I will open it up. I see we have something in the chat. Happy to open it up for questions if anyone wants to just go ahead. And
Jocelyn, I have a question.
Yeah.
For Chris, actually.
Yeah.
What town council had made the determination as to whether or not this bylaw was passed? And also, what type of resistance, if any, was met in passing it? Have you had any lawsuits? Because this has got to be, it had to cut into a lot of revenue for a lot of homeowners up in Great Barrington. So I just wonder, what type of resistance did you meet with that?
There was certainly a lot of vocal resistance, primarily from folks who represent more commercial interests. People who had bought one or several properties with the pure motivation to rent them on a short-term basis as investment properties, as essentially, as I said, hotels and residential neighborhoods. Those folks in general weren't pleased with the regulation. No lawsuits or appeals. I'm not sure I understood your first question. Was that about whether it should be a zoning bylaw or a
Well,
general?
who voted in? How do you approach, how do you bring that to slate for the town?
Town council, CIL, not SEL. Our legislative body in Massachusetts, we're a town meeting form of government. So our legislative body is the voters, is the registered voters writ large. So we meet once a year in town meeting, and it was approved by the voters at town meeting by, I think it was a simple majority.
Yeah, so the equivalent here in Connecticut would be adopting an ordinance, and that would go to a town meeting vote.
I see.
Right.
Thank you.
To jump on the comment that Jocelyn had, there are some towns who in Massachusetts and other states who have regulated short-term rentals as zoning bylaws, and others who have regulated them as general bylaws or general ordinances. It's a difficult path to choose. Please talk to your town attorney or your city solicitor about what to do and what makes most sense. We chose not to go through the zoning route because if a property was already doing short-term rental before the ordinance passed, then they would be quote unquote, to use a bad term, grandfathered in, and would have certain pre-existing rights. And that's not a situation that we wanted to create. So we wanted to create it as a general ordinance. Everybody must comply. Doesn't matter when you do it. It's like, you got to license your dog. It doesn't matter if your dog was born yesterday or 5 years ago. It's got to be licensed. It's not a pre-existing non-conforming dog. So we definitely wanted to go through the general bylaw route for that reason.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Kim, you have a question? Oh, you're muted.
Because you asked, I was a good student. Chris, I have a question about what Great Barrington does with bed and breakfast and short, how that balances with this new ordinance. I mean, I'm on the Board of Selectmen and I'm on zoning, so I'm seeing it from both sides, and we're trying to grapple with how to handle that.
In Massachusetts, so the enabling legislation specifically put bed and breakfast and so-called lodging houses and the larger hotels in a separate category than these short-term rentals. And I saw that draft of an ordinance that Jocelyn had up there that's working its way through your state house has a similar call out. It says this short-term regulation is not applicable to the so-called B&B. I don't know the particulars of how they're defined, but that was when we first started talking about short-term rental regulation before the state enabling legislation. That was a concern from both hotels and the kind of quote unquote traditional B&Bs that they would be subjected to this sort of regulation. And once the state enabling legislation provided a clearer path, we were able to exempt them from this.
Just
They don't apply.
Thank you. So one more question related to that. There's some short-term rentals that offer breakfast. Are they considered B&Bs or are they considered short-term rentals?
They're short-term rentals unless they're registered with the state as a B&B. And I'd have to look at what that specific definition is. But if they have like an in-holders license with the town and they're registered as such with the state, then this doesn't, whether they offer breakfast or a whole house or just a room or a fire pit, or whatever amenities they have, it's how they're registered with the state and the Department of Revenue and whether they have a lodging license.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks, Kim. Anyone else have questions for Chris? I'll ask one, which is, I guess, what has been, have you had challenges enforcing, like what have been the challenges in the last year in terms of enforcement?
A lot of challenges in interpretation of the law. So this was, as I think a lot of laws are, written, I don't want to say in a vacuum, but you don't know where the devils are in the details until you start rolling it out and implementing it. And until somebody comes in and says, well, I'm a special case because A, B, and C. In our case, if an owner, for example, lives on site, they can rent it all they want. They don't need to register. But if they're not there, they need to register and they're limited to 150 nights. And so most of the questions that come in are, well, what category do I fall into? I do this, but I do that. And most of the time I'm here, but I'm not here then. And so there's been a lot of interpretation about who needs to register and who is in compliance or not. It's been very difficult and some heated conversations for sure for people who think this doesn't apply to them. We've tried to be as consistent as we can. We're a small town overall. We're the biggest in the Southern Berkshires, but staff-wise and otherwise, we're a small town. There's really only a couple people here who, are tackling this issue and making sure people are in compliance. And for the first 30 to 45 days after those non-compliance letters and you may be subject to a fine letters went out, I think for 45 days, that's about all they did was respond to questions from people who wanted to come in and argue a special case. So it's smoothing out now. I think now we're getting some experience with it.
Do you think it would have been good to just have everyone register?
Probably, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
It's so it has been a challenge. One thing we did not do in our rules was require a housing inspection or a health inspection.
Mhm.
We knew that if we required 150 extra inspections a year or more, we would not be able to do that with our staff. Even if we charged an arm and a leg so that we could cover the costs of hiring staff, you can't find staff to hire. So
Right.
so we said you may be subject to an inspection, but we were very careful to not require inspections, i.e. not burden our own staff with having to go out there.
Right, right. All right, so I see Justin has a question and then I'll get to Maggie. Go ahead, Justin.
Yes, thank you. What sort of revenue has Great Barrington collected from regulating these?
I don't have that number offhand. I'll try to find it and send it to Jocelyn, sorry.
Is it significant or roughly?
I would probably characterize it as not significant. Short-term rentals, so there's a rooms tax in Massachusetts, which Great Barrington has adopted. It's 6% of the nightly rate, and that applies whether you're a short-term rental or a large hotel. That is a significant amount of revenue. It's in the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars per year to Great Barrington. The portion of that is through so-called short-term rentals, like Airbnb type, I think is much smaller. I'm not sure what it is. I'll try to find that out. For a while, the state wasn't tracking the difference between the room tax revenue from a hotel versus room tax revenue from a short-term rental, but they've been doing that now. The way it works in Massachusetts is that the owner pays the state Department of Revenue, and then the state sends that back to the town. And so for a while, the funds were all in one pot. I'll see if I can find some numbers.
Great, thank
Do you have any sense of whether it's covering your staff costs to administer? I mean, I'm sure it's hard to say. Also, in the first year, it's probably, like you said, heavier than it will be in following years, but
it's tough to say.
Yeah.
Tough to say.
Okay.
It's probably not covering the cost of having to go out and contract with a software like GovOS, somebody who is watching the short-term rental websites and saying, here's who's listing. That cost was like $20,000 or $30,000 a year. The revenue from this particular regulation is not even coming close to that. So that's a cost that the town voters had to say, okay, we're going to vote this in. We know we need this contract to help us with registration and compliance, but it's not covering the cost.
Maggie?
Hi. I'm just wondering about this staffing question. I mean, it must depend on whether a town chooses to do this by ordinance or zoning regulation, who is responsible for going around and checking up on, like, is somebody at day 132 or 149? And you know, Great Barrington is a whole lot larger than our towns. I just can't imagine our town signing on for that software cost, for example, or even burdening the zoning enforcement officer, or who, the selectman's secretary is going to go around and do that. I mean,
right.
Well,
maybe
can I just offer, Maggie, that I think all of this is scalable.
Okay.
You know, I mean, I know that because I've been on webinars about this before. I know that there are ways that somebody who lists on Airbnb could take it off during the day when people are looking and then put it back on at night or whatever. But like, obviously you can go on as an individual and look at, you know, what's on Airbnb. So I think deciding what approach makes sense for you is, I think, is scalable, and how much enforcement you want to do. I will say I talked with the zoning enforcement officer in Sherman today, and he was basically saying if it's a town ordinance that they pass and a problem comes up with one of the short-term rentals, then they can call the state trooper.
Yeah.
And the state trooper can enforce it rather than their zoning enforcement officer. But just wanted to throw in there, like, I agree with you, Maggie. I don't see any of our towns paying $20,000 for software. But I do think that all of these solutions can be kind of scalable.
Right. It sounds interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, Maggie. John?
Yeah, thank you. Couple of questions. One, just on the definition of short-term rentals. I'm just wondering if it's a statewide definition or town defined. I noticed in Fairfield, it had 6 days or less for a definition. And Great Barrington was 30 days or less. I didn't know if there's a
I'm
universal
gonna see if
definition or if it's just decided by the towns. And then the
Um,
second question was the primary purpose for Great Barrington. I noticed in your summary for the regulation, you talk about the commercial properties, and it looks like your focus was on commercial properties and not the homeowner. And there's no mention of affordable housing as a benefit in the purpose. So I'm just wondering why affordable housing benefits might have been more defined in the purpose of that, because it sounds like what we're trying to do and the impact from short-term rentals impacts affordable housing, yet the intent and purpose that wasn't mentioned.
Good questions. Really good questions. So in terms of what a short-term rental is, whether it's not more than 30 days or 31 days or more, or whatever it is, we were very careful to make sure our definition of number of days was the same as set forth by the state enabling legislation. So we didn't want to cause confusion about that. So the state said 30, we said 30. That was the benchmark for us.
Do you know if there's a difference between states, or is it so new?
There may well be.
Yeah, okay.
well, and John, if this bill passes, it has a reference here to what must be a definition, which I can send to you. It's obviously not law yet, but if it passes, there would be a definition there that towns could use.
Well, that would be useful, because we wouldn't want to have something that didn't comply with the state, I would think, but you know, its purpose could be different by town, I would imagine. It could be, but
the second point was about the purposes, and you're right. Our purpose section does not list affordable housing as a purpose. That was something that was debated quite a lot. There were some folks during the planning board and select board discussions who continually brought up affordable housing as something that this would help with, and it was debated. At the end of the day, we thought it would be difficult to show that that this would have a benefit on affordable housing. We hoped, as I said, that it would perhaps allow more long-term rentals to be available. But there was no guarantee that, for example, Jocelyn had an earlier slide from, I think, Salisbury, where there was a house for like $10,000 a month. regulating that and taking that off of Airbnb or VRBO is not going to create an affordable housing unit. I mean,
Right.
let's just face it, that and Great Barrington has a lot of those. So it is something we talked about. In the end, it was something that we didn't think we could really come down and say, yes, we are meeting that purpose. We are creating affordable housing, or we are allowing more affordable housing to happen in Great Barrington. So that's where we ended up. I hope that answers your question.
No,
And-
it does. It's just if the net result of all that is, of course, it's only a year in place, but the net result of all that is not really benefiting affordable housing.
We hope it benefits by making more rentals available long-term. Tough to
Right.
quantify, as I said.
Right.
And in terms of affordable housing strategies, I wouldn't characterize this as an affordable housing strategy. Certainly, it's not listed in the purposes of the law. And if you were to say, what is Great Barrington doing for affordable housing, I wouldn't even mention short-term rentals. So you're right to bring that up. Our housing strategy is affordable housing strategy focuses on zoning. I mean, we're very lucky. We have municipal water and sewer in most areas of most of the developable areas of town. So we can get a lot of density in our commercial core, unlike some of Litchfield County. So our strategy includes zoning and includes pouring a lot of money into helping nonprofits and others, including for-profit entities, build affordable housing, buying land to create affordable housing. So our strategy is keeping people who are in affordable housing, keeping them in their homes through housing rehab programs, keeping their homes safe, reasonably affordable to heat,
Right.
things like that. So if you were to say, what's your affordable housing strategy, I wouldn't include short-term rentals. That
Well,
being said, I do want to, there was a point earlier about accessory units. Our Affordable
Yeah.
Housing Trust Fund is creating an interesting new pilot program where they're looking at to incentivize people to build accessory units and deed restrict them as affordable. And if you do that, the Housing Trust will give you a significant grant to make that happen. So stay tuned.
Yeah, I like that idea, Chris. And I was going to mention that too. This idea, like in Burlington, Connecticut, basically just not allowing those accessory apartments to become short-term rentals, I think can be, a strategy, and especially since so many towns are looking at accessory apartments at ways to create not necessarily dedicated, restricted affordable units, but again, because they're, secondary dwellings that are, smaller in size than the primary dwelling, that they could create some more, as what people call accessible housing options. So I think one quick thing towns could do is just not allow the accessory apartments to be rented short term. Or I know some towns are just, if you're allowed 2 accessory apartments on a property, the second one can't be short term or something like that. Just wanted to note a couple things in the chat. Judy looked up the cross-reference in the bill for us, and it is defined as a period of 30 consecutive days or less. So again, that will be helpful to towns if that bill passes. Jim Dresser's question is, if there's no enabling legislation like that, what is proposed in that bill yet, how can these towns pass an ordinance? To which I would just say, I think that, clearly they got some information from their town attorney that they could pass an ordinance with those things. Obviously, if this enabling legislation passes, it will just make more of those towns comfortable that they have that authority. But certainly, I think we've seen not just in this situation, but others as well, towns will go ahead and address an issue, even if there's not specific enabling legislation. But that just opens them up to potential, you know, it can open them up to potential lawsuits. So it's obviously safer if there is this enabling legislation. We are getting near time. I will take another question if anybody has them, but I do want to note real quick, just in closing, I want to thank Chris for his time and his willingness to be here with us in Connecticut. We so appreciate it. It is great to learn from Great Barrington's experience. And I mentioned to Chris, I owe him, I go to Great Barrington frequently, just over the border, and I owe him a coffee. So thanks, Chris.
My pleasure.
We appreciate it.
This is a great group, great idea, this coalition, this group. So good luck.
Can I just add? Can I
Yeah.
just add, as a realtor, I see this being advantageous from a real estate standpoint because I have buyers that want to buy homes and they want to make sure that they're not next door to an Airbnb or across the street from an Airbnb for noise concerns. So I think this could be really advantageous in a lot of the smaller towns.
Thanks. Terrific. All right. So I just want to mention before everyone logs off our other couple webinars that we have coming up here. April 23rd, we're going to launch our new housing needs assessment tool. So any town in Litchfield County will have access to a bunch of data points around your housing needs, your demographics, affordability, your existing housing stock. And that is on an interactive web-based platform. So we're eager to launch that and have you see how you can use it in your community. That will be April 23rd. And then in May, we're having a webinar to talk about how affordable housing is workforce housing, because there's some confusion there. And Justin from Kent Affordable Housing is going to talk a little bit about the survey that they've just done for the folks that work in Kent, specifically about their housing needs. We can talk about that. So you can't obviously click on the slide right now to register, but if for some reason you don't have the flyer and you want to register, just reach out to me. I will send the slides to everybody that was here today. And I will send you a link to a bunch of those other examples. If you need anything else that I don't send you, obviously feel free to respond and I will get you what you need. So thank you again, Chris, and thank you to all the attendees for being here. And have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn.
Thanks.
Thanks, Jocelyn. And
Thanks,
Chris.
Judy.